The lawyer had not finished the second sentence of the second paragraph when my son leaned forward across that long walnut table, folded his hands the way a man folds a napkin at a restaurant where he intends to complain, and asked in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the whole room to hear how soon we could access the funds. He did not say Mom, he did not say Maggie, he did not say my mother, may she rest in peace, or my mother whom we buried 11 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning that smelled like wet pine. He said the funds. Douglas Pruitt, who had been my friend for 31 years and my wife's attorney for the last 19, set down his silver pen without looking up, and the small click it made against the table was the loudest sound I had heard in 11 weeks. Across from me, my daughter-in-law Brienne exhaled through her nose in a way I had only ever heard her do at Thanksgiving when the turkey came out drier than she wanted, and my grandson Caleb, who was 16 and had not been required to attend but had come anyway because his mother told him it would look better, looked down at his own knees like a boy who had just watched his father shoplift in front of a cashier. Ruth Ellery, the paralegal, put one careful hand flat on her yellow legal pad, and I understood in that particular half-second that I had been correct about everything I had spent the last 9 weeks quietly preparing to be correct about. I did not answer my son. I did not look at him. I looked at the small brass clock on Douglas's bookshelf, which read 10:42 in the morning on the 16th of April, and I thought distinctly and without heat that Maggie had been dead for 77 days, and my son had waited exactly none of them. But to understand why the click of that silver pen sounded like a bridge cable snapping, you have to go back 4 months to the January afternoon when Maggie called me in from the garden to sit at the kitchen table and told me, with her hands folded around a mug of tea gone cold, that she had already decided 3 things and she was going to need my help doing them properly. She kept the porch light on. That was the thing I noticed first in the days after, before I noticed anything else. The porch light stayed on all night, whether or not I remembered to turn it off, because Maggie had, for 42 years of marriage, kept it on for whoever might be coming home late, and after she died, I could not bring myself to be the one who changed that. So the porch light stayed on, and I sat at the kitchen table where she had sat, and I waited to find out what my son believed I was, now that his mother was no longer standing between us. I had been an engineer for 40 years before I retired at 65. Bridges mostly, and a handful of small municipal buildings across 3 states, courthouses and library additions, and 1 water treatment plant I was quietly proud of. Engineers are not, as a rule, dramatic people. We measure, we double-check, we assume that anything built by human hands will eventually fail, and we design for the day it does. What we learn over enough decades is that failure almost never comes from the load you planned for. It comes from the small stress you did not name, running quietly through the structure for years, until one ordinary afternoon it finds the seam. I had spent my career finding those seams before other people did. It was, I suppose, the only real skill I had, and I did not know, in the January that Maggie sat me down at the kitchen table, that I was about to need it in my own house. Maggie was 66 that January. She had been diagnosed the previous October with something the doctor described in the careful, apologetic vocabulary doctors reserve for people they cannot save. She had chosen, after 2 weeks of thinking, not to pursue the more aggressive treatments. She said she wanted the months she had left to smell like her own kitchen, not a hospital. I did not argue with her. In 42 years, I had learned that when Maggie used that specific quiet voice, she was not asking for a conversation. She was telling me what was going to happen. So I sat at the kitchen table on the 11th of January, and she pushed a mug of cold tea towards me, and she told me the 3 things she had decided. The first was that she wanted her funeral small. Reverend Kesting, her sister Judith, the neighbors on our short cul-de-sac, Ethan and his family, no open casket, lilies, not roses, because roses reminded her of hospitals. The second was that she had already spoken twice with Douglas Pruitt, and she was going to speak with him again because there were arrangements in her will she wanted to change, and she wanted me to know exactly what those changes were before she made them, so that I would not be surprised in a lawyer's office in front of our son. The third was that whatever happened after she was gone, I was not to make any decision about the house, about our savings, or about Ethan for at least 6 months, because grief, she said, was the worst possible engineer, and I would build something crooked if I built it too soon. She smiled a little when she said that, because she knew exactly which word would land. Then she took my hand across the table and said, very simply, Harold, our son is not the man we hoped he would be, and I need you to be ready for that in a way I never was. I did not answer her right away. What I did was set my coffee cup down slower than I meant to, because Maggie had, for the entire span of Ethan's adult life, been the wall between what our son actually was and what she needed him to be. She had signed a lease for him in 1997 when he was 22 and paid the last 2 months when he skipped town on the roommate. She had put $11,000 into an investment scheme he brought home in 2006 that a man named Marcus Dell had convinced him would triple in 18 months, and when it collapsed, she told me not to bring it up at Christmas. She had 3 separate times between 2012 and 2019 wired money into Ethan and Brienne's account without telling me until months later, always with the same phrase, they just needed a little bridge. And I had let her, because a bridge was a word I understood, and because the alternative was fighting with the woman I loved about the son we shared. Maggie knew what she had been doing. She had told me that January afternoon that she knew. She had said in that same quiet voice, I have been the reason he never had to grow up. And now I am not going to be here, and you cannot be me, Harold. You have to be you. You have to be the engineer. I asked her what that meant exactly. She said, it means when the day comes, and it is going to come, you do not raise your voice. You do not beg. You measure. You measure everything, and then you decide what has to hold and what is allowed to fall. She said it the way she used to say things to the 3rd graders in her library when she wanted them to remember. Then she went to the counter, and she took down the red leather notebook she had kept for 30 years, the one she wrote her recipes in, and apparently a great deal else. And she opened it to a page near the back and slid it toward me. On that page, in her narrow blue handwriting, were 4 columns of numbers and dates and names of accounts, and 1 paragraph at the bottom, and 1 small drawing of a house. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I closed the notebook and slid it back to her and said, all right, Maggie, tell me what you need. She lived for another 11 weeks after that afternoon. She died on the 29th of January at 4:11 in the morning in the hospital bed we had set up in our downstairs den so she could see the porch through the window. Ethan and Brienne drove down for the last 3 days. Caleb sat in the corner and read a paperback he was not really reading. Lila stayed at a friend's house because Brienne said she was too young. Judith came and stayed 12 hours and left because she had to get back to her own husband and did not come back until the funeral. Reverend Kesting sat with Maggie for 2 of her last afternoons and read her 3 specific psalms she had asked for. On the morning Maggie died, Ethan hugged me exactly once, for what could not have been more than 4 seconds, and then he went outside to make a phone call, and when he came back in, he asked me whether I knew what the house was worth in the current market. He asked it the way you ask what time a movie starts. I did not answer him. I set the coffee cup down slower than I meant to. The funeral was on the 2nd of February. It snowed a little, not enough to stick. Reverend Kesting spoke for 11 minutes, which was exactly the length Maggie had requested. Nora Halloran, our neighbor across the cul-de-sac, brought a casserole dish so heavy she had to set it down twice on the way from her car. Ruth Ellery, whom I did not yet know well, came because Douglas had asked her to, and she stood at the back in a gray coat and did not speak to anyone, and left an envelope on the side table by the door that turned out later to contain a handwritten note in which she said only, I lost mine in 2017, and the first spring is the hardest thing you will ever build through. She had underlined the word build. I did not understand that afternoon why she had chosen that word. I understood later. Ethan spent most of the reception in the corner of the living room with Brienne, and twice I overheard him use the phrase the estate as if it were a piece of furniture he was trying to move through a doorway. Once I heard Brienne softer say to him, we just have to be patient, and once I heard him answer, I have been patient. Caleb, who was standing near the coat rack, heard both of those sentences too. I watched his face when he heard them. He did not look surprised. He looked like a boy who had been hearing the same conversation in his own house for a very long time, and had only just realized that other people could hear it now too. That was the first thing that really hurt. For the 6 weeks between the funeral and the inheritance meeting, I did what Maggie had told me to do. I measured. I did not confront. I did not raise my voice. I did not, in any conversation with Ethan or Brienne, indicate that I had noticed anything at all. When Ethan called me, which he began doing on average every 4 days, always around 6 in the evening when Brienne was making dinner, and asked me casually about accounts, about the mortgage that had been paid off in 2009, about whether Mom had left any specific instructions, I said only that Douglas was handling everything and that we would all sit down together in April when he had the paperwork ready. Ethan did not like that answer, but he could not argue with it, because Maggie had built the timeline herself, in her own handwriting, in the will she had revised twice in her last 4 months, and he did not yet know how carefully she had built it. What I did during those 6 weeks was open Maggie's red leather notebook every morning at the kitchen table with the porch light still on because I could not remember to turn it off, and I worked through her 4 columns of numbers the way I would have worked through a stress analysis on a bridge span. The first column was accounts. The second column was amounts. The third column was dates of the last withdrawal or transfer. The fourth column was names. There were 7 names in the fourth column. 2 of them were mine and Maggie's joint accounts. One was the paid-off house. One was a small brokerage account I had known about for 30 years. And 3 of them were accounts I had never heard of in my life, in Maggie's name only, at a credit union 2 towns over, opened in 1998, 1999, and 2004. The paragraph at the bottom of the page said, in her narrow blue handwriting, I opened these the year Ethan co-signed that lease. I kept adding to them because I did not trust what he would do if he knew about them. I am sorry I never told you. Do not be angry. Just be the engineer. Then, below that, a small drawing of a house and 1 sentence. The deed is not where he thinks it is. I read that sentence 11 mornings in a row before I called Douglas Pruitt. Douglas asked me to come into the office on the 14th of March, which was a Thursday, and Ruth Ellery closed the door behind me herself. Douglas laid out on his desk the will Maggie had signed on the 9th of December. 3 separate account statements from the credit union 2 towns over. A deed for the house that had been placed, in 2011, into a trust in Maggie's sole name, and a second, thinner folder that he did not open right away. He said, Harold, before we go through any of this, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest because your wife asked me to ask you when the time came. Do you want to know everything she prepared? Or do you want to know only what you need to know to survive the meeting on the 16th of April? I said, Douglas, tell me everything. He opened the thinner folder. There were, in that folder, 17 pages of copies. Copies of texts between Ethan and Brienne, printed by a private investigator whose name Douglas did not offer, from a phone Brienne had left unlocked at our house one weekend in October, before Maggie had gotten too sick to have anyone over. Copies of an email chain between Ethan and a man named Marcus Dell, dated between November and January, discussing what Ethan referred to as the transition, and what Marcus referred to, more bluntly, as the payout. Copies of a preliminary listing agreement Ethan had signed on the 18th of December, 42 days before his mother died, with a residential real estate agency in the next county for a property he did not own. The property was our house. Ethan had signed the listing agreement in his own name and had checked the box on the form indicating that he was the sole heir of the current owner, whose passing was, in the language of the form, anticipated within the calendar year. I read the 17 pages twice, then I closed the folder, then I set my coffee cup down slower than I meant to. Douglas said Maggie found the first text on the 11th of December. She came here on the 12th, she changed the will on the 14th, she hired the investigator on the 16th. She signed everything you just read on the 9th of January, 3 days before she sat you down at the kitchen table. She did not want you to know before she died, Harold. She said you would spend her last weeks looking at your son a different way, and she wanted her last weeks to look like her kitchen, not like this office. He waited a long moment. Then he said, she also said if you asked, to tell you that the porch light was for Ethan when he was 17 and used to come home late from work, and that she kept it on all those years because she was still hoping he was coming home. I did not answer him. I looked at the small brass clock on his bookshelf, and I noted that it was 2:19 in the afternoon on the 14th of March, and I thought about the first bridge I had ever inspected as a young engineer in 1979, over a small river in a county I no longer remembered the name of, and how the senior engineer walking with me had pointed to a hairline crack in a concrete pier and said, "That crack has been there since the day they poured it, son, and it will still be there when we are both dead. But one day, on an ordinary afternoon, the water is going to find it, and then it is going to be the only thing anybody sees." I said, "Douglas, what does she want me to do?" He said, "She wants you to do exactly what you were going to do anyway. She wants you to walk into that meeting on the 16th of April. She wants you to sit down. She wants you to say almost nothing. She wants Ethan to speak first, in front of Brienne, in front of Ruth, in front of me, and she wants him to say out loud, in a room where every word is being recorded by the standard estate protocol, what he has been saying in texts and emails for 4 months. And then, and only then, she wants me to open the second folder. She said, Douglas, my husband will know when to nod. He always does." I nodded. For the 33 days between the 14th of March and the 16th of April, I lived the way I had lived for the 6 weeks before that, which is to say I lived carefully. I turned the porch light off every morning at 7, and I turned it back on every evening at 6. I answered Ethan's calls. I told him only that Douglas had the paperwork nearly ready. Twice I had them over to dinner, Ethan and Brienne and the children. and twice I cooked exactly the way Maggie would have cooked. A pot roast on the first Sunday of April and a lemon chicken on the second, and I watched Caleb push food around his plate, and I watched Brienne look at the crown molding in the dining room the way an appraiser looks at a house. Once, on the second Sunday, Caleb helped me clear the plates, and while we were alone in the kitchen, he said, very quietly, without looking at me, "Grandpa, are you okay?" I said, "I am, Caleb, thank you for asking." He said, "Grandpa, Dad talks about this house a lot." I said, "I know he does, Caleb." He said, "Grandpa, I don't want the house." I said, "I know you don't, son." He said, "Grandpa, please don't be mad at me." I said, "Caleb, I could not be mad at you if I tried for 100 years. He nodded once and put the plates in the sink and did not say anything else. That was the moment I understood that the boy had known for months and had not known what to do with knowing and had been carrying it in a body that was still growing bones. I did not tell him anything. I only put my hand on the back of his neck for exactly 2 seconds, the way my own father had done to me once when I was 15, and I let him go back into the dining room to sit next to his mother. On the 10th of April, Nora Halloran walked across the cul-de-sac in a gray cardigan and knocked on my door at 4 in the afternoon. Nora had lived across from us for 38 years. She had lost her husband in 2008 and her older brother in 2015, and she had, in the decades I had known her, said exactly what she meant every single time. She sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I made her and did not say anything for almost 4 minutes, and then she said, "Harold, I am going to say one thing, and then I am going to go home because I am 72 years old and I do not have the time for a long conversation. Your boy has been walking through the yard when he thinks nobody is home, twice last week, once with a tape measure." She said, "Some children grow up. Some children just get older." She said, "I am sorry, Harold, and I know that is not much." Then she put down her coffee cup and she went home, and the porch light was on because I had forgotten to turn it off that morning, and I sat at the kitchen table for another hour and I did not move. On the 16th of April, at 10:38 in the morning, I walked into Douglas Pruitt's office in a gray suit I had last worn at Maggie's funeral. Ethan was already there in a navy blazer he had bought for the funeral, and had, apparently, decided also constituted appropriate attire for accessing the funds. Brienne wore a cream-colored blouse and a small gold cross I had never seen on her before. Caleb sat in the chair furthest from the table in a hooded sweatshirt his mother had told him twice to take off, and he did not take it off, and I loved him for it. Lila was not there. Judith, Maggie's sister, had been invited by Douglas at Maggie's specific request and had driven down from 2 hours north, and she sat to my right in a black cardigan with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles were white. Ruth Ellery sat at the end of the table with her yellow legal pad and a small digital recorder that Douglas had explained, in the calm procedural voice he had used at hundreds of these meetings, was standard for the state and would remain on for the duration. Douglas opened the folder in front of him. He began, as he always did, with the preliminary reading. Maggie Whitaker, of the county of, on the date of, being of sound mind, and so on. He read the first 2 paragraphs. He began the third. He said, "The primary residence located at is bequeathed in full to." He had not finished the second sentence of the second paragraph when my son leaned forward. Ethan folded his hands. He said, "Douglas, before we go any further, and no offense to Dad, but we all know where this is going, and Brienne and I have some pretty time-sensitive stuff on our end, so I just need to ask, how soon can we access the funds?" The click of the silver pen was the loudest sound I had heard in 11 weeks. Brienne's exhale through her nose came half a second later. Caleb's eyes went to his own knees. Judith made a small noise, not quite a word. Ruth Ellery put her hand flat on her legal pad. Douglas Pruitt looked up slowly, and he looked not at Ethan but at me. I nodded, just once, the way Maggie had said I would. "Douglas," said Ethan, "before I answer that, I want to make sure I understand your question. When you say the funds, can you tell me which specific funds you are referring to?" Ethan said, "Well, the estate, Mom's estate, whatever is in the estate, the house, the accounts, whatever she had." Douglas said, "And when you say access, do you mean access as a beneficiary or access in some other capacity?" Brienne said, quickly, "We mean as beneficiaries, of course, Douglas. We have some obligations coming up, and it would help to know the timeline." Douglas said, "I see." And Ethan, before I continue, one more question, just so the record is clear. Have you, at any point in the last 6 months, taken any action based on an assumption about what those funds would be or when they would be available? Ethan hesitated. Only for a moment, but I saw it. Brienne saw it. Caleb saw it. Ruth Ellery, without moving, saw it. Judith saw it and closed her eyes. Ethan said, "Of course not, Douglas. We were just planning, generally, thinking ahead. Mom would have wanted us to think ahead." Douglas said, "All right, Ethan. Thank you for that clarification. I am going to continue the reading now." He continued the reading. The primary residence, located at 317 Linden Court in the township of, was bequeathed in full to Harold Whitaker, husband, for the duration of his natural life, and thereafter, in a trust designated by Margaret Whitaker on the 9th of December, to the following individuals in the following proportions: 35% to Caleb Whitaker, grandson, upon his 25th birthday; 35% to Lila Whitaker, granddaughter, upon her 25th birthday; 20% to Judith Marsden, sister; 10% to a scholarship fund in the name of Margaret Whitaker at the county public library system. Ethan's mouth opened. Then it closed. Then it opened again. The joint savings accounts, previously held with Harold Whitaker, remained in full with Harold Whitaker, as they had been jointly held for the entire span of the marriage and were not, in fact, part of Maggie's estate at all. The brokerage account, valued at $41,000, was bequeathed to Harold Whitaker. The 3 credit union accounts, located 2 towns over, and containing, in total, $312,000 accumulated in small deposits over 26 years, were bequeathed in 3 separate trusts. $104,000 to Caleb, held in trust for education until his 22nd birthday. $104,000 to Lila, held in trust for education until her 22nd birthday. $104,000 to a private, non-revocable trust in Harold Whitaker's name, with a single named secondary beneficiary, who would be identified at Harold Whitaker's discretion at a later date. Douglas closed the folder. He said, "That is the reading of the will as filed on the 9th of December of last year. Are there any questions?" Ethan said in a voice that had climbed slightly. "Douglas, I am sorry, I am confused. There is nothing here for me." Douglas said, "That is correct, Ethan." Ethan said, "That cannot be right. She was my mother." Douglas said, "She was, Ethan. She was your mother for 41 years. And on the 9th of December of last year, she instructed me to file the will you have just heard." Ethan turned to me. He said, Dad, this is not what she would have wanted. Mom would not have done this. Mom would not have cut me out. Dad, tell him." I looked at him. My son, 41 years old, navy blazer, the face that had once been small enough to fit in my palm. I said, "Ethan, your mother did exactly what she wanted to do." Brienne said, "Harold, with respect, this is clearly something you two decided together, and I understand that you are grieving, but this is not legal. We will contest this." Douglas said, "Brienne, you are of course welcome to consult independent counsel, but I would recommend before you do that, you allow me to read one more document into the record." He opened the second folder. That was the false peak. That was the moment where Ethan and Brienne, and possibly even Judith, and possibly even I, might have believed the meeting was almost over. That was the moment where Ethan's face had gone from red to a mottled, sort of pale, and Brienne's hand had begun to reach for her purse in that specific way people reach for a phone when they are already composing the outraged text in their heads. That was the moment where, if the meeting had ended, Ethan could have walked out of Douglas's office, believing that his mother had made a cruel decision in the fog of illness, that he had been unfairly cut out by a grief-stricken father and a manipulative lawyer, and that he could rebuild the story into something he could tell himself for the rest of his life. He could have been the wronged son. He could have hated me quietly for 20 more years, and it would have felt, to him, like justice. Douglas opened the second folder. He said, "Ethan, I want to read to you from an email chain dated between the 14th of November and the 8th of January between yourself and a Mr. Marcus Dell of Dell Financial Advisory Services." He said, "I have printed the entire chain, and I will provide copies to all present parties, but for the purposes of the recording, I will read the 3 most relevant passages." He read them. He read the passage from the 21st of November in which Ethan had written, "Mom's got maybe 4 months tops. Doctor was pretty clear, so we're looking at March at the outside. And once probate clears, we're talking about, conservatively, 600 grand between the house and whatever she's got squirreled away. Dad is basically a non-issue. He'll do whatever we tell him." He read the passage from the 9th of December, dated the same day Maggie had signed the will, in which Ethan had written, "Meeting with the realtor next week to get preliminary listing paperwork. Mom will not know. Dad definitely will not know. By the time it matters, it will not matter." He read the passage from the 3rd of January, in which Ethan had written, 26 days out, "Hospice says any day now, we are going to need to move fast on the house, because Dad is going to want to keep living there, and that is not going to work for us." The room was very quiet. Brienne's hand was no longer moving toward her purse. It was flat on the table. Her cream-colored blouse had gone a color I did not have a name for. Ethan was looking at the wall behind Douglas's head as if he were trying to remember an address. Caleb was crying, not loudly. He was 16 years old, and he had learned, in whatever house he had been growing up in, to cry without sound. Judith was crying too, but differently. She was crying the way people cry when they have known something for a long time and have been telling themselves they did not know it. Ethan said, "Dad, that is out of context. That is not what it looks like." Marcus was. We were exploring options, Dad. Look at me." I did not look at him. I looked at the small brass clock on Douglas's bookshelf. 10:51 in the morning. 9 minutes since he had asked how soon he could access the funds. Douglas said, "There is one more document, Ethan." He read the preliminary listing agreement, the 18th of December, 42 days before Maggie died. Ethan's signature. The box checked indicating sole heir, the anticipated timeline, the asking price he had suggested, which was, I noted without heat, 11% above what Douglas and Maggie had the house appraised for in 2022. Ethan said, "Dad, please, Dad, I know how this sounds, I know how this looks, but you don't understand what things have been like for us, Dad. Brienne's business is, we are not okay, Dad. We needed a plan. We needed to know there was a plan." That was his almost reasonable moment. That was the one sentence in the entire meeting where, if I had let myself listen only to the words and not to the timestamps, I might have almost, for a half second, felt something soft toward my son, because he was not entirely lying. Brienne's business had been losing money for 2 years. I had known that from Maggie, who had known it from Brienne herself, who had cried about it at our kitchen table in the July, before Maggie got sick. They were not okay. That much was true. But then Ethan finished the sentence. He said, "And honestly, Dad, Mom was never going to spend it anyway." Douglas closed the second folder. I looked at my son. I did not raise my voice. 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 And I want to say clearly that there was a moment, and it lasted 3 long breaths, where I did not know if I was going to hold. There was a moment where I could feel at the base of my throat 41 years of every time Maggie had said he just needs a bridge, every time she had wired money in secret, every time I had let it happen because the alternative was fighting with her, every time Ethan had come to our house for a holiday and eaten the food she made and left without helping clean up, every time he had called her for money and never called just to hear her voice, and I could feel all of it rising, and I could feel the shape of the sentence I wanted to say. And it was not a long sentence, but it was the kind of sentence that ends things forever, and my mouth was already partway open around the first word. And then I remembered Maggie at the kitchen table on the 11th of January, cold tea in a mug, her hand on mine. I remembered her saying, "Harold, you do not raise your voice. You do not beg. You measure." I remembered her drawing the small picture of the house in the red leather notebook. I remembered her saying, "The deed is not where he thinks it is." I remembered her saying, "I have been the reason he never had to grow up, and now I am not going to be here, and you cannot be me, Harold. You have to be you." I closed my mouth. I set my hands flat on the table, the way Ruth Ellery had set hers flat on the legal pad. I said, "Ethan." He said, "Dad." I said, "Your mother knew. Your mother knew on the 11th of December, when she saw the first text on Brienne's phone in our guest room. Your mother knew when she changed the will on the 14th. Your mother knew when she hired an investigator on the 16th. Your mother knew for 49 days before she died. She sat across from you at our dinner table on Christmas Eve knowing. She held your hand in the hospital bed in our den knowing. She did not tell me because she did not want her last weeks to look like this office. She wanted them to look like her kitchen. She told Douglas to tell me the day I was ready to hear it, and Douglas told me on the 14th of March. Ethan's mouth was open. He said, "Dad, that is not possible. That cannot be. She would have said something." I said, "Ethan, she said something. She said it to Douglas. She said it in her own handwriting, in a notebook I have in my kitchen drawer, and in a will you have just heard read out loud, and in 3 trust accounts your children will benefit from in 9 and 13 years. She said everything she needed to say. You just were not the person she said it to." Brienne said, "Harold, please, you have to understand, this is going to ruin us. Please, we did not think, we thought there was time." I said, "Brienne, there was time. There was 13 years of time. There was every Christmas since 2012. There was every phone call she made that you did not return. There was every Sunday she asked when you were coming down, and you said soon and did not come. There was time. You spent it." Judith was weeping openly now. Judith said, "Harold, I am so sorry. I knew about the texts. Maggie told me at Thanksgiving, and I did not know what to do. I'm so sorry. I should have come and told you. I should have said something. I was scared he would. I did not want to be the one who. I am so sorry, Harold." I looked at Judith, 64 years old, Maggie's little sister, in a black cardigan she had bought for the funeral. I said, "Judith, it is all right. It was not your job. Maggie chose. She chose me. She always chose me. Douglas said, "Ethan, I want to be clear about what happens next. Your mother did not file any criminal complaint. She could have. There is enough in the documents in front of me to have supported a claim of anticipated fraud. She specifically instructed me not to pursue it. She said, in her exact words, he is still my son, and I do not want the last thing I do to be a police report. That was your mother, Ethan. That was the last thing she did for you." Ethan was crying now. Not loudly, not sound crying. Face crying. He said, "Dad, please, I can fix this. I can fix this. Dad, please look at me." I looked at him. I said, "Ethan, I love you. I have loved you since the 2nd of September, 1984, at 3:47 in the morning, when the nurse handed you to your mother and your mother handed you to me. I have loved you every day since then. I love you today. I will love you tomorrow. That is not the thing that changed. What changed is that I now know what you did in the 7 weeks before your mother died, and I am not going to pretend I do not know it. That is what your mother built this meeting for, not to punish you, to make sure you could not pretend either." He said, "Dad, what am I supposed to do?" I said, "You are supposed to drive home with your wife and your son. You are supposed to think about what you just heard. You are supposed to understand that your daughter is going to grow up in a house where the money is not coming. You are supposed to understand that your son already knew, Ethan. Your son already knew. Look at him." Ethan looked at Caleb. Caleb was staring at the floor. I said, "That boy has been carrying this for months. That boy asked me last Sunday if I was okay. He is 16 years old and he has been the adult in your house since before Christmas. You go home, Ethan. You do the work of being his father. That is what you are supposed to do." Ethan did not speak. Brienne stood up. She said, "Ethan, we are leaving." She did not look at me. She picked up her purse and she walked out of Douglas's office and down the hallway, and I heard the outer door open and close. And Ethan stood, slowly, and looked at me for one more long moment, and then he followed her. Caleb did not stand. Caleb sat in his chair in his hooded sweatshirt and looked at me, and then looked at Douglas, and then looked at Ruth Ellery, and then looked at Judith, and then looked back at me. I said, "Caleb, it is all right to go with your parents." He said, "Grandpa, can I stay with you today?" I said, "Caleb, of course you can stay with me today. Ruth, would you be so kind as to call his parents and let them know that Caleb is going to come home with me for the afternoon? Douglas, is that all right?" Douglas said, "That is completely all right, Harold. Ruth will handle it." Ruth Ellery said, "Of course." That was the first wave. The second wave took the better part of 6 weeks. Marcus Dell, whose name Douglas had read 3 times into the recording that stayed on for the full 91 minutes of the meeting, and whose emails had been printed in 17 copies, was contacted the following Monday by an attorney of Douglas's acquaintance, who worked in a different area of the law than Douglas did. Marcus Dell's advisory license, which had been suspended once already, in 2016 for a matter Ethan had never bothered to look up, was suspended again on the 22nd of May. He was not charged with any crime, because no crime had been completed, only planned. But the second suspension meant, as a practical matter, that he could no longer legally do the work he had been doing, and by the middle of June he had moved out of the small office he kept in a strip mall 2 counties over and stopped returning his brother's phone calls. Brienne's interior design consultancy lost its 2 remaining clients within 11 days of the meeting. I do not know exactly how that happened. I did not ask. I have my suspicions about one particular phone call that Nora Halloran's son, Peter, the volunteer fire captain, made to a woman he had gone to high school with who happened to be the office manager for one of those clients. But Nora did not tell me, and I did not ask her. And there are some things it is better not to build a bridge across. Ethan's employer, the medical supply company where he had worked as a regional sales manager for 8 years, conducted what they described in a letter to Ethan dated the 3rd of June as a routine review of managerial conduct. The letter did not specify what had prompted the review. Ethan was not fired, he was demoted. His territory was reduced from 4 states to 1 state, and his commission structure was adjusted downward by roughly 40%. I do not know precisely how that review was prompted either. I do know that Ruth Ellery had at some point in early May mentioned in passing, in front of no one in particular, that her nephew worked in the human resources department of that same company. I do not think Ruth did anything improper. I think Ruth mentioned, in the way that people mention things, that there had been a family matter and that certain documents existed. Ruth had lost her husband in 2017. She had, on the day of Maggie's funeral, underlined the word "build" in her handwritten note. I understood now what she had meant. The house at 317 Linden Court, which had been placed in a trust in Maggie's name in 2011, remained where it had always been. I lived in it. I turned the porch light on every evening at 6. I turned it off every morning at 7. In the second week of May I began, for the first time in the 11 weeks since Maggie's death, to remember to turn it off in the morning without checking twice. Caleb came to the house on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, but most. His parents did not stop him. I do not know if that was because they were paying attention or because they had stopped paying attention. Caleb and I fixed the loose railing on the back porch on the third Saturday in May. He held the boards while I drove the screws. He asked me at one point whether it was hard to become an engineer. I said, Caleb, it is a lot of measuring. He said, I am okay at measuring. I said, I know you are, son. Judith called me on the second Wednesday of June. She said, Harold, I want to tell you something, and I want to tell you before too much more time passes. I said, all right, Judith. She said, at Thanksgiving, when Maggie told me about the texts, she also told me something else. She told me she was not afraid of dying. She told me she was afraid of leaving you alone with him. She said she had built a house for 42 years, and she was afraid he was going to knock it down in a season. I said, Judith? She said, she also told me that you were the only man she had ever known who could stand still in a storm. She said you would not knock anything down. She said you would just keep the porch light on until the storm was over. I did not say anything to Judith for a long moment, and then I said, thank you, Judith. Judith said, Harold, I am sorry it took me so long to say that. I said, Judith, some things are hard to build the words for. She said, yes. That is what she used to say too. Nora Halloran walked across the cul-de-sac on the last Sunday of June with a Tupperware of blueberry muffins and sat at my kitchen table in her gray cardigan and drank the coffee I made her. She did not say anything for almost 4 minutes. Then she said, Harold, I have known you for 38 years, and I want to say one thing, and then I want another cup of coffee. I said, all right, Nora. She said, some children grow up and some children just get older, and every once in a while, if the parent is very lucky and very quiet and very patient, a child who is only getting older will finally one day start growing up. She said, I don't know if yours will, but your grandson will. And that is not nothing. That was the third wave, not a dramatic one, not a public one. A quiet, permanent shift in the world, arriving without announcement. Caleb, 16 years old in a hooded sweatshirt, sitting at my kitchen table on Saturday afternoons, learning to measure. Lila would be 25 in 13 years and would find at that time that her grandmother had left her $104,000 for an education. And she would decide at that time whether her grandmother had been right about her. Caleb would be 22 in 6 years and would find the same. Judith drove down every third Sunday and stayed until 9 at night. Ruth Ellery sent me a card on the anniversary of Maggie's death that said only, the first spring was the hardest, and I know because you built through it. Reverend Kesting stopped by twice and did not ask questions and did not offer answers and drank the coffee I made him and left. I did not press charges against my son. Douglas had asked me once in early May whether I wanted to pursue the preliminary listing agreement as a matter of civil law. He said there was a case there. He said it would be uncomfortable but winnable. I said, Douglas, Maggie already told you what she wanted. Douglas said, I know she did, Harold, but she also told me to make sure you knew you had the choice. I said, Douglas, I have the choice. And I choose the same thing she chose. He is still our son. He did not manage to do the thing he wanted to, and he planned to, and he told other people he was going to, and that is a thing he will have to live with. But he did not do it. And Maggie built this whole meeting so that he would not have to be a criminal on top of everything else he already is. Douglas nodded once. He did not ask me again. Ethan called me on the 12th of August, 4 months and change after the meeting. He had not called before. I had not called him. He said, Dad, it is Ethan. I said, I know, son. He said, Dad, I am not calling to ask for anything. I said, all right. He said, Dad, I am seeing somebody. A counselor. I have been for 8 weeks. Brienne is not, but I am. I said, all right, Ethan. He said, Dad, I do not expect you to say anything to that. I just wanted you to know. I said, Ethan, I heard you. He said, Dad, is Caleb okay? I said, Caleb is okay, son. He said, is he coming over on Saturdays? I said, most Saturdays, yes. He said, does he talk? I said, some. He said, does he talk about me? I said, Ethan, that is between him and me for now. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Dad, I understand. I said, I know you do. He said, Dad, one more thing. I said, all right. He said, the porch light. I noticed at the funeral, it was on, in the middle of the day. Was that on purpose? I said, Ethan, your mother kept it on for 42 years. I said she kept it on for anyone who was coming home. He was quiet again. Then he said, Dad, I do not know if I am coming home. I said, Ethan, that is not a decision you make in one phone call. That is a decision you make in 100 phone calls. He said, okay, Dad. I said, okay, son. Then we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. It was 2:17 in the afternoon on the 12th of August. The porch light was off because it was daytime, and I had, for the last 3 months, remembered to turn it off in the mornings. I got up. I walked to the front door. I opened it. I reached up and I turned the porch light on. It was daytime. It was not necessary. Nobody was coming home that afternoon. Nobody was going to see it. But I turned it on anyway because Maggie had kept it on for 42 years for anyone who might be coming home, and I had learned in the 7 months since she had told me she had decided 3 things at the kitchen table: that some doors you only get to close one time, and some lights you never really get to turn off. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened Maggie's red leather notebook to the page with the 4 columns of numbers and the small drawing of the house. I looked at it for a while. She kept the porch light on. That is what I would have said if anyone had asked me about my wife. Not that she was kind, although she was. Not that she was patient, although she was that too. Not that she was strong, although she was the strongest person I ever knew. Only that she kept the porch light on for 42 years. For me when I was late from the office in 1981. For Ethan when he was 17 and coming home from his job at the hardware store in 2001. For her sister Judith when Judith's marriage almost ended in 2009 and Judith drove 3 hours down in the middle of the night. For the neighbors when their power went out in the ice storm of 2014 and half the cul-de-sac slept in our living room. For anyone at all. She kept it on because she believed, in a way I have only just started to understand, that the job of the people who are still here is not to close the door on the people who are lost. The job is to leave the light on, and to measure carefully, and to hold what has to hold, and to let what has to fall gently, and to not confuse the two. Ethan was not lost yet. He was only older. Whether he grew up in whatever years he had left was not, in the end, for me to decide. Maggie had known that. That was why she had left him nothing in the will and everything in the meeting. She had given him, on the 16th of April at 10:42 in the morning, the only inheritance that had ever really been his to receive. She had given him the truth. What he built with it was his. Caleb came over the next Saturday. We fixed the second railing on the back porch. He asked me if I thought his dad was ever going to be okay. I said, Caleb, I do not know. I said, I hope so. He said, Grandpa. I said, yes, Caleb. He said, thanks for keeping the light on. I said, son, that was your grandmother, not me. He said, Grandpa, it is you now. I set the hammer down slower than I meant to. She kept the porch light on.